We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
Is the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching. Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Coming up on today's Camilla Tominey show, with the Gary Lineker row still raging, I'll be speaking to Robert Buckland, former Justice Secretary, about the government's migration plans. I'll also be discussing them with Damian Green, former Deputy Prime Minister. And I'm going to be joined by Lord Sumption, former Supreme Court Justice, to discuss his reaction to the lockdown files. All that and more to come, but first, here's the news with Ray Addison.
Thanks, Camilla. Good morning. It's 9:30. Here's the latest. The BBC was forced to broadcast Match of the Day without commentary or studio punditry last night after broadcasters boycotted the channel over its handling of the Gary Lineker controversy. The former footballer has been stood down as presenter over a tweet criticising the government's migration policy. In the Sunday Mirror, Lineker's eldest son, George, said he thinks he will return to the show, but he won't back down on his word. Rishi Sunak is flying to the United States today to discuss the AUKUS defence deal between the UK, US and Australia. It's hoped that after a summit with President Biden, the Australian Premier will announce the purchase of British nuclear-powered submarines. While in the US, Mr Sunak is expected to reveal a defence and foreign policy update. And the Health Secretary has criticised junior doctors for failing to call off strike action on Monday. Writing in The Telegraph, Steve Barclay described the 72-hour walkout as incredibly disappointing. The British Medical Association has described Mr Barclay's recent offer to negotiate as a feeble attempt to stall us. It's expected to have the biggest impact of any industrial action by health unions since December, affecting A&E, cancer care and maternity. on TV, online and on DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Back now to the Camilla Tominey Show.
Well, good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. We haven't boycotted ourselves. We are here. We will be providing commentary. We will be analysing the news. And what we'll be doing is doing it in a nuanced way. Because as you know and I know, you can't discuss immigration policy in 140 characters or less on Twitter. You have to do it by asking people the relevant questions, discussing things and not branding people who disagree with you Nazis. And that's the joy of GB News, folks, because we are the People's Channel after all. Now, before I introduce my newspaper guest, let me just go through the headlines, which, as you can imagine, are dominated by Lineker. So here we are. First of all, the Sunday Telegraph. I have got the Sunday Telegraph, but I haven't got the Sunday Telegraph on the prompter, so I'll look down to it. I won't quit, says BBC boss, as he hints at climb down. Now, this is quite interesting because the Sunday Times initially did Lineker chaos piles pressure on BBC chief, but then it changed up to this story, which we will get into because I think this is kind of gaining momentum as the day goes on. Fears of global tech chaos as bank collapses. So we'll be discussing that in just a minute. The Observer again goes with the sports pundit. Lineker row threatens to topple BBC chief and hit asylum plan, suggesting that perhaps the government's plan on all this could be scuppered by the intervention of the Match of the Day host. The Mirror, Lineker, I'll never be silenced, he says. Then in the Sunday Express, again, are you noting a current theme, a running theme of the Sunday papers today? BBC Sport blackout. The Mail on Sunday goes with PM hits back in Lineker storm. That's after Rishi Sunak released a statement about it all yesterday night. And then in the Sun on Sunday, we have penalty shootout, which is probably quite a good way to describe the to and fro between Lineker and the BBC, which looks set to continue into tomorrow as Lineker's people get together with Tim Davie to work out a solution. Now, I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Michael Crick, legendary political journalist, but also massive football fan, so we can pour through this particular story. Now, I know when we say to you, come in and do the papers, and normally we've got a great deal of variety on the front pages. Not so much this morning, Michael. There's only one story in town on this Sunday, isn't there, really?
And it's extraordinary. It is an apparently trivial story in some ways. And, at a time when huge economic problems, Ukraine, everything, this is dominating the front pages. But it is actually an important story. And it's a showdown which, in my view, the BBC, the Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie, has to win. He has to lay down the principle that somebody who is the BBC's highest paid employee on 1.3 million pounds a year cannot simply tweet as he feels like on a huge matter of public policy, possibly the big issue for the general election, the whole question of small boats and immigration. And certainly if it's not the issue, it'll be one of the major issues. And the trouble is both sides have painted themselves into a corner, really. Gary Lineker has made it clear that he's not going to be silenced. He's going to carry on saying these things. And Tim Davie has made it clear that he's got to stop saying these things. And if Davie backs down on this, I think he's going to have to go as Director General. His authority will be shot through.
Yes,
and I think it's very unlikely that Gary Lineker will back down because he clearly feels very passionately about this whole issue.
Do you have any understanding for this argument, because you're a former BBC man yourself and obviously a journalist, that there are different rules for BBC journalists than there might be for BBC sports pundits?
Yes, of course, I can understand that. The trouble with this, though, is that Lineker is, arguably the most prominent member of BBC staff in a way, even though technically he's freelance. He's certainly the most well paid. And I just think if you turned it round and if the presenter of the Match of the Day had said, full marks to the government, I fully support, sending everybody back who's come over in the small boats, you can imagine the outcry that would have caused amongst BBC staff and calling appalling for him to lose his job. So there's a lot of hypocrisy going on here, and basically people are lining up depending on what their own political views are. My position is that you have to preserve broadcasting impartiality, particularly with the main terrestrial channels like the BBC, because broadcasting impartiality is one of the things, in my view, which binds this country together at a time when people want to tear the country apart in a way, and our discourse has become more and more polarised.
And if you had tweeted what he tweeted when you were political editor of Newsnight, you'd have expected to be fired the very next morning, wouldn't you?
Exactly. Although you could say political editor of Newsnight, that's a different kind of job from being presenter of Match of the Day. But I do think that Tim Davie is right to crack down on Lineker. After all, he made a return, really, to proper impartiality and the maintenance of impartiality, a main plank of his Director Generalship. It's really important to him, and he's had some success so far, and one or two people have frankly been got rid of.
Yes.
And if he doesn't win this battle, then it's going to be very, very difficult to discipline anybody at a lower level, a reporter or somebody who works for Radio Lincolnshire or something, who comes out with political statements on social media, which of course is the easiest thing in the world to do, particularly when you're drunk late at night.
No, that's right.
Not that I'm suggesting that Lineker did this when he was drunk.
Although, yeah, we should never tweet drunk. We know that much, Michael. Now, what else is in the papers? What was interesting was that the Sunday Times changed up their Lineker story to this story about this Silicon Valley bank in the US. Is this actually bigger than the papers today have covered? It seems to be growing in...
Well, I think it should have had more coverage in the papers, and the problem, as you well know, with Sunday papers is they tend to go to bed, go to press, quite early, and the Sunday Times, rightly in my view, has given it attention. I don't think this is another Northern Rock, but there are clearly that we know there have been talks between emergency talks, really, between Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, and Rishi Sunak over the weekend about this, and that shows the extent to which they're worried about it. And of course, ahead of the budget on Wednesday, and Jeremy Hunt and Sunak want to turn Britain into a technological superpower. And the trouble is, with the collapse of the British arm of this bank, is that there are technology companies that have their money with that bank, who have thousands of employees. It could be a severe blow to the high-tech industry, and the government is going to have to come up with some kind of package, really, to save them. But I don't think that we're going to see I mean, I'm not an economic expert, but I don't think we're talking about, from what I can gather, a run on the banks and the kind of financial crisis that we saw way back in 2008 to 9.
Will there be a public appetite for another bank bailout by the government? I don't think so.
Well, I think it would be pretty small scale.
Yes.
And really, it's not so much a bank bailout as a sort of a lifeboat for the people who are dependent, the companies that are dependent on this bank to run their businesses.
I'm having Liam Halligan on later and Lord Villamoria, so they will be able to discuss this in greater detail.
Well, they'll probably talk about it much more sensibly than I've done.
Ahead of the budget. Yeah, I don't like... This is the trouble with journalists, Michael. We are functionally enumerate most of the time. This is the trouble with economic stories.
We're generalists a lot of the time, as well, aren't we? Yeah.
Now, another under-the-radar story of the weekend is, of course, this doctors' strike, which is taking place next week. Again, it's not front-page news, but it probably should be.
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's hardly covered on the inside pages either. I mean, you've got up on screen there the Mail on Sunday account of it. They're fairly hostile to the junior doctors, who are calling for a whopping 35% pay rise, which seems enormous, even with 10-11% inflation right now. But of course, they say that is purely to restore their pay to the levels of 2008 to 29, 15 years ago. And they do work extraordinary hours, and there are all sorts of pressures on them. Now, I mean, if the government is never going to concede a pay rise like that, but clearly the government is going to have to address this. I mean, it's a 3-day strike.
Yeah.
It's going to have a real effect on the health service. Emergency services, cancer appointments are going to have to be postponed.
But
and all of that knock-on effect.
I'm wondering whether they have as much public support as, say, nurses, because I think there's probably a perception that even if junior, doctors are paid pretty well. I mean, I know they're saying that they want 35% more, but most people look at it and go, 35% pay rise? I'm in the private sector, couldn't even get 5 of that 35%.
I know, but there is actually a poll in the Sunday Times today that suggests the public do actually support junior doctors on this. Now, that may change, and of course the crunch will come if we get stories over the next 3 days of this strike action of people who are, who die as a result of this, or are thought to have died.
Emergency people not being seen in time.
It's the A&E people that are the real problem. And then, of course, if appointments are cancelled, it could mean that cancer patients are having to wait weeks until their appointment, or are they going to move everybody? So, I mean, the ramifications are huge. It's a big story, again, in the run-up to the budget on Wednesday, when the Chancellor is going to have to start thinking about, is he going to have enough money from somewhere to settle some of these pay disputes?
Not at 35%, I would.
Not at 35%,
but maybe at some percent.
Yeah, indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael Crick, for joining me this morning. I hear you're off to the football later.
I am.
Might be in the stalls with Gary.
No, I don't think
he's not. Well, no, to be fair, you'll be at Manchester United. I don't think you're there. Right, thank you very much for that, Michael. Tom Harwood, GB News' Deputy Political Editor, is in Crawley. He's with the People's Panel, absolutely dying to know what the punters in Crawley make of Gary Lineker, of migration in general. Do they think that they're Nazis if they are against illegal migration? Tom, tell me everything.
Well, yes, some big questions to explore today. We're at Oliver's Coffee and Wine, a wonderful cafe just outside Crawley, and I'm delighted to say we can have a few words with the manager, Chris. And Chris, how's business?
Business is great. It could always be better, but coffee and wine, the cornerstone of modern civilization. We have a great clientele and life is good.
Well, I have to say I had a wonderful bacon sarnie from you this morning, and it served me very well. But let's, without further ado, get on to our People's Panel. The reason we are here, I'm delighted to say we're joined by Roger, Radabe and by Bob. Roger, first of all, what's the issue that is most exercising you at the moment?
Well, I think it's housing. It's been for a long time for me, and young people can't afford houses. We're having to build as many as the size of Nottingham, to every year to accommodate the number of people coming into the country, and even the people living here can't afford a house. So I think that's something that needs fixing.
Yeah, ties in with the migration question, no doubt. Radabe, how about you?
I'm currently very worried about the division and hatred that's being caused in this country. If you have an opposing point of view to the current narrative being pushed by certain lovies and everything, then you are called all sorts of names, and I really resent that. We should respect each other's views and just go along with and get on with each other. At the moment, it's shocking, I think, and people like Lineker, who I'm sure you'll come to shortly, just makes it worse.
And Bob, what is the thing at the top of your mind right now?
Well, I think there are so many things, but there's a terrible decline in the quality of politicians and politics generally over the last few years. We don't seem to be, they talk a lot, we don't seem to be able to achieve anything. We haven't achieved proper Brexit, we haven't achieved a proper agreement on Northern Ireland, we haven't been able to control immigration, we still haven't got our own fisheries back, and we still haven't controlled law and order. And as Roger said, the housing around here, there are houses, thousands and thousands of houses being built, and they're not being built for local people, they're built for people moving into the area because London and the other cities are becoming so crowded.
Well,
there's a general decline.
Some really big issues there, but I think it would be remiss for us not to discuss the issue that has been on the front pages of newspapers for the last 5 days, that of the position of a certain BBC sports presenter. Roger, what do you make of Gary Lineker?
Well, Gary Lineker is undoubtedly using his position on Match of the Day to forward his beliefs, and that's fine in a way, but he's saying that he's giving people a voice who haven't got a voice. Well, there's millions of people out there who haven't got a voice. He's been very selective on who he gives a voice to, and there are loads of people waiting for operations on the NHS, people waiting for houses who haven't got a voice. So I think it's very selective of him, and I wonder if it's about Gary Lineker rather than anything else.
And of course, this conversation all started with the new illegal migration bill. Radabe, you came to this country legally, 10 years old, some time ago. Only 10 years, I assume. What do you make of it all?
I agree with what Roger said about Lineker. Firstly, he wouldn't have the platform if he wasn't working for the BBC and didn't have that exposure. So whatever he claims, I think that he's fooling us all. But yes, I came here with my parents, didn't have a say in the matter, but I was brought here by my parents, and love it. I love this country. We've always integrated. We were usually the first Asians in the road, worked hard all our lives, contributed to the system, and I don't understand why people just think they can roll up on a beach and get everything given to them. There are legal routes. I'm sorry, people who say let's develop legal routes. Well, there are legal routes. I came through on a legal route, and others have. So, I disagree with what's going on our coastline.
Yeah, I suppose it's about that legal process, sticking by the rules of this country. Bob, what do you make of it all?
It's all about Lineker. He's in a dispute with the HMRC about millions of pounds of tax, and I think he's trying to prove he's independent of the BBC, which will help him in his tax dispute. And he's not a person that I admire. I admire his footballing, but I avoid watching him on the BBC, let's put it that way. And I don't buy his crisps either.
Well, on that note, let's turn back to you, Camilla. We'll have plenty more discussion from the People's Panel a little bit later in the show.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. Just to say, I think Mr Lineker may disagree with some of the analysis there of his tax affairs, so we do need to point out that he denies any wrongdoing when it comes to his relationship with HMRC. Next week, we're going to be in York for the People's Panel. To apply, please go to gbnews.uk/panel. Let's bring in my next guest now, Robert Buckland. Sir Robert Buckland, I shall use his proper title, is the former Justice Secretary, also the Tory MP for Swindon South. Robert, lovely to see you this morning.
Lovely to see you.
You're the perfect person here to just talk about some of the legality, first of all, of this illegal immigration bill. Lord Sumption, who we're having on a little later in the show, said in his judgment in 2013 it is an international obligation of the UK under Article 46.1 of the Convention to abide by the decisions of the ECHR in any case to which it is a party. This obligation is in terms absolute. Can we clarify, can the ECHR block these plans?
If there is a case involving the United Kingdom, those remarks of Lord Sumption's are absolutely right. If it is case law that doesn't involve the United Kingdom, it's not binding. What happened very recently to cause controversy was that there was a decision made by a judge in Strasbourg to, in effect, hold up the policy on Rwanda. It was a particular procedure that's quite a new one that we didn't have a chance to make representations upon, and frankly I would question the basis of it. However, that's very different from saying that there is some overwhelming deep-seated problem here related to our membership of the convention. I'm sorry, but I don't see the evidence here that suggests that withdrawal from the convention will change the nature of this problem. We'll still have domestic laws, domestic judges, rules of fairness that have to apply when people make applications for asylum. That's what we've prided ourselves on. That's the English rule of law system. So I don't think the convention, the European Convention, is the right target here. The problem here is that this is an operational issue that affects all the countries of Western Europe, and none of us are really coming together to set quotas, to set limits, and to try and control the way in which people are either being exploited or choosing to come here via illegal means.
Rishi Sunak and Emmanuel Macron tried to come together in the week. They've obviously set aside a huge amount of money, £500 million on a new detention centre, more patrols. Do you have faith in that? I think GB viewers and listeners will be saying, well, hang on, we've given the French hundreds of millions. What the hell have they done with it?
Yeah, well, I think the money has been spent indeed on detention centres and more provision. But, that's like sort of trying to just fill a hole while at the same time the bottom of the hole is still developing. The real problem here is a lack, I think, of common purpose amongst the countries of Western Europe to say, hold on, we are always going to be able to welcome asylum seekers, but we do need to plan for the future. And not knowing the numbers, not having any control on that, causes strain on schools, hospitals, all the public services, and indeed housing, which of course some of the panel were talking about.
But you talked about quotas there, and then we did have a cap, didn't we, on immigration some time ago, and then the Tories abandoned it. Was that a mistake?
Well, I think we're confusing two things here. I mean, there's general migration, which we control via a visa process. We've got advice on where we have job job shortages, and I think it's right that, for example, in health and other areas, we do recruit people to come to this country to help us run our services. But when we talk about asylum seeking and on that side of immigration, that's a different issue. And I think there the government is right to say, let's set a quota in Parliament every year so we can then plan, and local government, local authorities can plan ahead. But at the same time, that sort of approach is only going to work if we do open up some more safe and legal routes internationally to allow more applications to be made from abroad. At the moment, you know, the only schemes are Hong Kong, which is great, Ukraine, absolutely right, Afghanistan, we all understand that. But there's no other way of making an application. I'm not saying open the doors.
I was going to say, Sir Robert, you are sort of sounding a bit like Lineker here, and you're a Conservative former minister.
I am absolutely against an open door policy. I think this false juxtaposition between comparing, you know, what the government's doing to 1930s Germany, which I think is entirely in it. But when you start talking about the Nazis, you've lost the argument.
Yeah.
And then this other argument that if you're against it, you're in favour of open doors. That's bogus. What we should be talking about is increasing safe and legal routes, but up to a certain quota, a certain limit. And I think if all the countries of Western Europe agreed that, that would be progress. You know, I'm realistic here, Camilla. I think we're far away from an agreement. We're having a row with France. France and Italy are having a row about the same thing. And unlike in Ukraine, where we came together to challenge a bully and an illegal invasion, we're failing, I think, as a political leadership in Europe to come together to sort out this problem.
Another row seems to be brewing in the Tory party about children and this bill. Priti Patel has come out today. 2 newspapers have covered it. There's concern that actually we may then see a return to children both being detained and deported. You must be very uncomfortable with that.
I am, and I've said so publicly in the newspapers as well. I agree with Priti on this. It's been our policy as a government not to treat children in that inhumane way. Now, I absolutely understand that there's a concern that somehow children and women are being used as a sort of, you know, way in for unscrupulous people to come into this country. But, you know, I think we've really got to think carefully before using detention centres or you know, places of incarceration for children. I just don't think that's right, and I hope that in the course of the debate we can look at that and refine
the government said when they announced this bill that children would be exempt from it. So are we now not believing what they're saying?
Well, I think that some of it might be due to the drafting. Yeah. I think we need to look very carefully as parliamentarians at exactly what they're saying. It was made clear to me, and I think rightly so, that you have to have exemptions for children and the very ill. If you have a total blanket policy, I think, you know, any court is going to have a problem with that. And there are exemptions in there, which is why, you know, the government is confident that they are working within international law obligations.
Moving on to Lineker, what should happen to him? I mean, shouldn't he just stand down now and move on? Clearly, he can't keep his views to himself, and he's contravened impartiality rules at the BBC.
Well, it's a matter for him and his employers.
But what do you think?
Look, I think personally, I disagree with the way he said, as I've just said. I think as a private citizen, he's entitled to express his views. We live in a country of free speech and untrammelled free speech, however much we might disagree with it.
It's not about free speech, though, is it? It's about him breaching his contract.
Well, as I say, if I haven't read the terms of his contract, if there are contractual issues with the BBC, he's got to sort that out with his employer. So
should somebody at the BBC be undermining government policy like this? I mean, it's not a great look for the Tories. You've got loads of people piling in on Twitter in support, people holding up banners at football stadia. Doesn't really help the government in trying to crack down on a really difficult problem.
Yeah,
who does he think he is?
I think that it's best for politicians like me to stop piling in, let the BBC sort out what is an employee issue, and then deal with it in that way. And we should respect the judgment of the BBC. I think the Prime Minister's right about this. Let's not wade into this row. You know, I will defend everybody's right to free speech, even though I might disagree with it, and that includes Mr. Lineker. But I really think this is taking the focus away from the sort of serious discussion we just had about the detail of these policies.
Let's just very quickly move on to Joanna Simpson, the tragic case of the wife that was killed by Robert Brown. Now, I know her mother is one of your constituents. Have you got confidence in your successor, Dominic Raab, preventing this man from being automatically released from prison?
Yes, well, lead campaigner Hetty Nanton is my constituent, and Diana Parks is, of course, the mother of her great friend, Joanna. I do. I'm very pleased that the government and ministers have met the campaigners, and I think that whilst we can't prejudge what the final decision is, I think the government is looking at the powers that I introduced to help.
Thank you, Robert Buckland. We'll be back in a break.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Co.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Click that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Co. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today.
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Coming up, I'm going to be speaking to Jonathan Sumption, the leading lockdown critic once referred to as the brain of Britain. He's going to give me his take on the lockdown files. I'll also be speaking to Damien Green, Theresa May's deputy PM, on the illegal migration bill. But first, here's the news headlines with Ray Addison.
Thanks, Camilla. Fast approaching 1 minute past 10. Here's the latest. Gary Lineker's eldest son, George, has told the Sunday Mirror he thinks his dad will return to Match of the Day, but he won't back down on his word. It comes after the BBC was forced to broadcast the show without commentary or studio punditry last night. Broadcasters have boycotted the channel after the former footballer was stood down over a tweet criticising the government's migration policy. Former BBC executive Roger Bolton says the controversy is diverting attention away from the real issue.
It's this argument about what is impartiality and who must be impartial that is a wider question. Of course, the other thing that's happening here is the political parties, particularly the governing parties, see this as a wonderful opportunity in the culture wars to create trouble and divert attention from the fundamental issue here, which is illegal immigration, which is extraordinarily difficult to deal with.
Rishi Sunak is flying to the United States today to discuss the AUKUS defence deal between the UK, US and Australia. It's hoped that after a summit with President Biden, the Australian Premier will announce the purchase of British nuclear-powered submarines. While in the US, Mr Sunak is expected to reveal a defence and foreign policy update in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Chancellor is set to crack down on prepayment meters when he announces his spring budget. From July, pay-as-you-go customers will no longer be charged more to receive their energy. The Treasury says the change will save more than 4 million households £45 a year. The Health Secretary has criticised junior doctors for failing to call off strike action on Monday. Writing in The Telegraph, Steve Barclay described the 72-hour walkout as incredibly disappointing. The British Medical Association has described Mr Barclay's recent offer to negotiate as a feeble attempt to stall us. It's expected to have the biggest impact of any industrial action by health unions since December, affecting A&E, cancer care and maternity. A 29-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of terrorism offences after a woman was stabbed outside a leisure centre in Cheltenham. The woman sustained severe injuries but is in a stable condition in hospital. The man is currently being questioned by counter-terrorism officers. And the final preparations are underway for one of the biggest nights in Hollywood as celebrities prepare for the 95th Oscar Awards, with British and Irish talent hoping for a win. The Banshees of Inisheer has become the most Oscar-nominated Irish film ever, getting 9 nominations. Meanwhile, British actor Bill Nighy is up for Best Actor for his role in the movie Living, and actress Andrea Riseborough is nominated for Best Actress in the film To Leslie. On TV, online and on DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Back now to Camilla Tominey.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show with me, Camilla Tominey. We'll be speaking to Damien Green, the former Deputy Prime Minister, in just a moment about the migration bill, Gary Lineker and other issues that have dominated the papers this weekend. But first, I'm joined by Lord Jonathan Sumption, retired Supreme Court Justice and one of the country's fiercest lockdown critics. Now, Lord Sumption, you wrote in The Telegraph yesterday that Matt Hancock's leaked WhatsApp messages, quotes, throw a harsh light on those involved. Their narcissism, their superficiality, their hypocrisies great and small. Above all, they show in embarrassing detail how completely power corrupts those who have it. Do you think Matt Hancock's behaviour was one of the worst abuses of power that we've witnessed in recent British political history?
Well, it was an abuse of power. Abuses of power are unfortunately very frequent. I'm not going to compare one with the other. I'd prefer to do without any of them.
But at the same time, they cast him and other ministers in a terrible light. There's this notion of government via WhatsApp, with the normal structure of government gone completely out of the window, knee-jerk decision-making, public policy being made on the hoof. I mean, where was the transparency and accountability? If it wasn't for these lockdown files, we'll never have known some of the decision-making behind unprecedented measures that affect our lives and civil liberties.
Yes. I mean, whatever you think about lockdowns, and it's a controversial issue, and I realise that not everyone's going to agree with my position on that. But whatever your view about the lockdowns themselves, what these files show is the complete disorganisation of the governmental process. This is classically a failure of government. The government took the original lockdown decision against the recorded advice of SAGE at the time. The whole government, and to some extent SAGE, then moved into propaganda mode and set about frightening people, partly in order to justify their decision and partly in order to force compliance. The result has been catastrophic collateral effects. But whether you agree with that or not, the governmental process was seriously defective. What it involved, or what it should have involved at any rate, was somebody to take a grip on the whole problem in the round, not just the clinical problem, not just the infection problem, but the economic problems, the educational problems, the social problems, the problems of mental health. And that never happened. I describe in my article Matt Hancock as a fanatic, because my definition of a fanatic is it's somebody who has only got room for one idea in his head at any one time. And that unfortunately characterized the whole of Matt Hancock's approach to this. He swatted away any kind of dissent. He refused to consider the examples of countries like Sweden, which had managed to avoid serious results without taking these drastic measures. He behaved in a way towards dissenters, like the unfortunate MP who nearly had his disability hub in his constituency cancelled because he threatened to vote against the tier system. This is an appalling way to conduct government, whether you agree with the outcome or not. The problem really is that you cannot have a system in which people are only looking at one aspect of the problem. All public policy is pluses and minuses, and you have to look at all of them. You cannot simply just look at half the problem and hope to solve it that way. And the blame I would put, not just on Matt Hancock, but on the Prime Minister, because it's traditional.
Yes, I was going to ask you about Boris Johnson. Yeah. I mean, you talked about a lack of grip. How would you analyse his behaviour?
The real problem is when you've got half a dozen different strands, some educational, some clinical, and so on, you need somebody to draw the strands together and decide on the priorities and how you're going to reconcile these things and how you're going to perhaps relax some priorities in order to be able to give some effect to others. Now, that is classically the role of the Prime Minister. And what the lockdown files suggest is that in many ways, Boris Johnson's heart was in the right place. He does seem to have had an idea of the serious economic and social damage that was done by lockdowns. He does seem to have felt that there were times when we should have relaxed the lockdown much sooner. But he never really had the courage of his convictions. Because he never really got down to the details of the problem, he was too easily pushed about by advisors who had an agenda which was based almost entirely on public relations. And one of the things that the lockdown files very clearly show is that rather than following the science, essentially the government followed what it thought the public wanted. Now, in some contexts, that's perfectly admirable. But there are occasions when statesmanship consists in saying to the public, look, this is what you're asking for is a quick patch and the long-term consequences will be disastrous. That's something that a statesman ought to be able to do. And Boris Johnson was completely incapable of doing it. So he was always being pushed back into the box by his advisors, pushed back into the shape that they wanted him to be in. And in the end, therefore, nobody was in control of the most important aspect of the pandemic, which was to decide how we are going to compromise between the health priorities, the economic priorities, and the other things that we should really be caring about.
Lord Sumption, you also described the Cabinet as a cabinet of mediocrity. Can you expand on that? Do you think that ministers these days just simply aren't up to scratch?
Well, I do think that. I did make it clear that I thought that there were exceptions to that. I mean, I think that Sunak and Gove, who took opposite views, as it happens, on the lockdown, are extremely talented individuals who would have an honourable place in any cabinet. But the problem about the cabinet as a whole is that it's been chosen primarily for its unconditional loyalty to Boris Johnson. And if you look back historically, you really have to go back to the early 1930s to find a cabinet so utterly devoid of talent as this one. I don't actually think that the quality of politicians has gone down, because I think that something like 2/3 of MPs have always been blockheads. But the great art of government is to choose your ministers from the others who are not blockheads. There are lots of talented people in politics. They're not in the cabinet. They certainly weren't in Boris Johnson's cabinet.
No, but then it sounds like you don't have much faith that so-called lessons have been learned from this pandemic. I mean, we can look to Sweden. We now hear from the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, who, as you know, was a lockdown hawk, praising Sweden for its response. I mean, how will we handle future pandemics, do you think? Any better?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, one of the problems in this area is it's very difficult when you have inflicted so much damage on a society to stand up and say, OK, we now realise it was a mistake. That's humanly very difficult to do. But I think it's actually unlikely, in spite of the fact that people are saying, OK, we did the right thing. I think it's unlikely they're going to do it again, even in comparable circumstances, because I think we've learnt an awful lot of detail about what was actually obvious from the outset. But we now have chapter and verse to show quite how much damage this has done, for example, to cancer sufferers, to old people who saw a huge spike in dementia, to children in particular, almost totally invulnerable themselves, but cooped up inside, deprived of education. Some of them will actually never recover. Some of them will. But, you know, this is a serious catastrophe in the making. And I think people are beginning to understand that. I doubt it'll happen again.
Lord Sumption, I'd be intrigued to know what your thinking is on the Gary Lineker row. Obviously, you may also have a view on the illegal immigration bill. What's your reaction to that story dominating the headlines this morning?
I'm not going to give you a reaction on that, because I don't think I should be sounding off on things without pretty carefully understanding them, and I haven't got properly boned up on that subject.
Do you mean Lineker or the immigration bill in itself?
Either. They're too closely related.
But then perhaps you have an opinion on whether the ECHR are going to block the legislation that's to be put before the House of Commons tomorrow, and whether it makes any difference. I mean, there's all of this talk about leaving the ECHR. What's your reaction?
The ECHR can't block UK legislation. All that it can do is to say this is inconsistent with the Convention, and in some cases it can award damages in favour of petitioners against the government for doing that. But it can't actually block the legislation. And if the legislation is passed, the judges in the UK will be bound to follow the legislation, even if it's inconsistent with the Convention.
But do you agree, finally, Lord Sumption, with this idea that human rights lawyers and other lawyers, I ask you as a lawyer, have been making it very difficult for the government to land any of these policies when it comes to controlling these 45,000 people who keep on landing on British shores in dinghies?
They obviously have been making it difficult for the government, but I don't think that one is entitled to complain if people make use of the law. If you don't like the way that they're making use of the law, then you need to change the law. Rather than criticise those who are doing their duty in allowing people to argue their side of the case.
Spoken like a true legal man. Thank you very much indeed, Lord Sumption, for joining me this morning. If you've got a view on anything that we've discussed in the show, please do get in touch. You know the email address by now, but let me repeat it. It's gbviews@gbnews.uk. Be delighted to hear from you about what you make of the Lineker row, what you make of what Lord Sumption has just said there about lockdown. Absolutely scathing about Matt Hancock and indeed the Cabinet, who he described as the worst since the 1930s. Well, let's speak now to somebody who was in a different Cabinet under Theresa May. Damien Green was former Deputy PM and Immigration Minister under David Cameron. He's also obviously the MP for Ashford in Kent. We'll get on to that in just a minute. But Damien, thanks for joining me. In principle, you support this illegal immigration bill, I believe, even though there is talk, perhaps among your own Conservative One Nation caucus, of dissent in the ranks.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't dissent in the ranks. I can say with some authority as chair of the One Nation caucus, but I do support this bill. And I think having proper control of illegal immigration is extremely important, particularly as a One Nation Conservative, because one of the things we believe in is a society that is bound together. And if people think that a large group of other people are breaking the law and are allowed to get away with it, then that actually damages coherence in society and with nasty effects. I can remember when I was Shadow Immigration Minister back in the Blair Brown years, when we did have very, very large and uncontrolled immigration. One of the side effects was the growth of extremely unpleasant far-right parties like the BNP, and I absolutely don't want to see that kind of thing coming back into British politics.
And yet we have the likes of Gary Lineker basically making out that moderate Tories like you and the people in the One Nation group are effectively like Nazis, behaving as they did in the 1930s. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think, on the whole, anyone who starts invoking the Nazis and comparing democratic politicians of any kind to them doesn't have much of an argument. That's a sort of absolute truth. So the wording of that now notorious tweet was clearly pretty foolish and quite offensive. Suella Braverman herself has made the point that her husband is Jewish, so she has family members who were killed by the Nazis, so people shouldn't use that kind of language freely or easily.
Should Lineker stand down tomorrow then? Obviously, he's boycotted this show. Fellow sports pundits have followed suit. He's got a meeting with the BBC Director General Tim Davie, we understand, in the morning. Should he just tender his resignation if he can't be impartial?
Well, it's not for me to take BBC management's decision for them, or still less Gary Lineker's decision.
You might have an opinion,
though. I would make the point that I find it completely extraordinary that in a week where we've had this hugely important immigration bill, we've had the best summit a British Prime Minister has had with the French since Brexit. We've got the Prime Minister flying out to America to sign a hugely important deal, a defence deal, and we've got the budget coming up on Wednesday. What we're all obsessed with is Gary Lineker's tweets. I think this is one of those occasions where in a year's time we'll all look back and think, what was that mad weekend where the only thing anyone cared about was Gary Lineker and whether there were commentators on Match of the Day? That was a bit weird, wasn't it?
Was a bit weird. What does Theresa May, your close Conservative colleague, make of the illegal immigration bill, do you think, Damien?
I don't know. I haven't spoken to her about it. And she wasn't there for the statement that the Prime Minister made last week. And from my long and deep knowledge of Theresa, the last thing she would want is other people trying to express her views on her behalf. I'm sure she will make her views known, and knowing Theresa, she will probably do it in Parliament if she wants to, because that's what she tends to do. She takes Parliament very seriously, and she makes speeches and interventions in the House of Commons. But I haven't spoken to her about it, so it would be unfair for me to try and sum up her views.
No, fair enough. It was only because she was slightly conspicuous by her absence as a former Prime Minister and also a Home Secretary. Obviously, quite a few people watching and listening to this interview will say, well, look, you were Immigration Minister back in the day. Theresa May was in charge of all this. You've had 13 years and you still haven't resolved this issue.
Well, immigration did come down when Theresa was Home Secretary and I was Immigration Minister. We never got down to the 100,000 target that we'd set, but we were on the way, and I think people gave the government credit for that. And what was interesting in those days, we didn't have a small boats problem. People in those days were trying to come across in the backs of lorries, and we did by and large stop that. And we did it by cooperation with the French, in that we paid for a lot of X-ray equipment effectively, which they installed at the Channel Tunnel and Calais, and that stopped it. So eventually people started trying small boats, which are of course much more dangerous. That's why I think the key to this is not just the legislation, which I think is good, but also the deal that the Prime Minister signed with the French on Friday, because having 500 extra French police on the shore and this new detention centre in France, that will make a real difference. That will make a real practical difference on the ground, because if we can stop them getting in the boats on the first place, that's a significant step forward.
Although people watching this and listening to this interview might think it's just more money for nothing. I mean, we've given the French hundreds of millions, and yet we've seen this exponential rise in people arriving here by small boats, 45,000 last year. The money seems to have been for nothing.
Well, it hasn't been for nothing. I agree that clearly if you like, the demand, the number of people trying to get across has increased massively. The French are at the moment stopping about 50% of the boats that come across. Now, obviously, what we want them to do is stop 100% of the boats, because lying behind this whole policy is deterrence. If you think this route is not going to work, then you will not shell out money to these terrible people traffickers, which is what they are, the criminal gangs that are running it in the first place. And that's why returns are so important as well. We have started returning people to Albania. That was a third of the numbers last year. And I think everyone who, having paid thousands of pounds or euros, goes back to Albania and is sort of moping around their local bar saying, well, I've spent all this money and now I'm back here, that will have a huge deterrent effect. So I think the additional French police is an extra deterrent, and that actually that's the long-term way of stopping this uncontrolled illegal immigration.
You mentioned that it's the budget on Wednesday. There's been a report in the Telegraph this morning talking about the fact that blue wall seats particularly are opposed to this hike in corporation tax. What's your view? We've just come out of a pandemic. You've got small and medium-sized businesses very much opposed to it. We've got talk of US companies pulling out of the UK because it's no longer seen as being as competitive. Should corporation tax rise to 26%, Damien Green?
Well, in an ideal world, not, of course. I don't know how much, if any, money the Chancellor has to play with, as it were, to say, you know, how can I use this money? I think my first priority, if he has got any, would be to extend the relief on energy prices for those groups that need it. I think that's very important. But the second would absolutely be business taxes and the approach to business generally. I want this to be a budget for growth and a budget to give us hope. And if the Chancellor can afford not to increase corporation tax by the full amount. Well, I mean, it's a question of whether he can afford to or not. I think at the root of this, we need to keep bearing down on inflation. The Chancellor of the Exchequer needs to be responsible with the public finances. We've learnt that very painfully over the past few months. So that's his first duty. Within that, I would very much like to see this as a budget for growth. And that involves things to help business, not just lower taxation, but other spending on infrastructure, on supporting those sectors where we're particularly strong and particularly good in this country, and where we need to be good and strong if we're going to thrive through the century, like artificial intelligence.
There is some suggestions that he's got 166 billion more fiscal headroom than he thought. But anyway, moving on to my final question. Now, we know about your deselection. Are you a victim of a Boris Johnson coup? What's happened here, Damien, and what are you going to do next? The meeting where I didn't get selected for the Weald of Kent, Boris Johnson wasn't mentioned. That was a piece of rationalisation. Do you blame him, though?
Put on by one journalist that everyone followed up. No, I don't. I don't think it had much to do with that. It was the people at the meeting expressed discontent with the system where one name was put in front of them. And you ask what I'm going to do next. I'm going to apply for the other half of my current seat, the new Ashford seat, and try and get selected for that.
All right, well, we wish you all the very best with that. Thank you so much for joining me this morning, Damien Green.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, let's see what Tom Harwood and our political panel make of all that. Tom Harwood is in Crawley. What do the people there think? What do they make of what I discussed with Robert Buckland and indeed Damien Green and Lord Sumption just now?
Yes, so much to get stuck into there, Camilla. But one moment of note, I think, is when Damien Green mentioned that sort of looking back at this time, perhaps a year from now, will this all seem like a bit of a mad weekend where people were talking about Gary Lineker rather than the budget, rather than the defence pact that the Prime Minister is going off to America to sign? Are there bigger issues? And I think there was some general agreement from our People's panel today. Roger, what did you make of that?
Well, it is undoubtedly a distraction. I wonder whether it's deliberate, really, whether they just don't want to talk about those other issues. But very interesting to see Damien Green talking about the budget and saying that they want to go for a growth budget. We're going back to Liz Truss there, aren't we?
Yeah, well, certainly. It seems like almost all parties are talking about growth now. Ritabe, what did you make of it?
I have to say that talking about the growth budget, and most commentators are now actually saying that maybe Liz Truss's plans, although she delivered them very awkwardly and rather too quickly, might have been the right way to go. She was all about growth, reducing taxes, etc. And I do wish they would cut the corporation tax, or certainly not increase it by 6%. I think that would be a very, very backward step, and it would disincentivize people from, setting up businesses, etc.
Now, Bob, there was a moment in that Lord Sumption interview where he very much echoed comments that you made in the first section of this People's Panel about the lack of quality of our politicians today.
Yeah, he said that the whole cabinet was dare I say, I can't say what he said really, or what he thought. It's absolutely terrible. He also said that there are people outside the cabinet who should be brought in. People like, dare I say it, Ian Duncan Smith, who, when you hear him speak nowadays, he speaks far more authoritatively than he ever used to when he was leader of the party. John Redwood's always been on the fringes, and a lot of people think he speaks a lot of sense. But these people are ignored. Especially if they weren't supporters of Rishi when he became leader by default, so to speak.
Now, there was some general murmurs of agreement there when Lord Sumption was talking about the lack of quality. Roger, do you think that politicians have gone downhill recently?
Oh, I don't think so. I think that they've always been pretty low, one way or another, if you look back on over the years. But the interesting thing is that as a cabinet, if you don't agree with, the minister, the prime minister, you're out, basically. So it's always going to be full of yes men. That's the big problem there. There aren't any dissenters because they're covering their jobs. They're going to lose their job. They push them out the back door. So that whole system, really, of just surrounding yourself with people who agree with you, I think is flawed.
And of course, Oh, sorry, Bob, did you want to get in there?
No, I was just agreeing, that's all. I think it's absolutely true.
I have to say that when people accuse the country of being racist, the Tory party of being all kinds of things, look at the cabinet now. It's the most diverse cabinet, from Boris Johnson to Rishi now, the most diverse cabinet we've ever had. And where is the Labour Party's female leader? It's crazy, and I think that we should just stop this and just accept people for what they are and their talents, and appoint people on whether they're whether they're good or not.
Now, of course, there was also discussion about the ECHR and whether or not judges are going to get tangled up with the new illegal migration bill. Roger, what do you think is going to happen over the next couple of months? Is the government going to get stuck?
Yeah, they are, because the lawyers love it, don't they? The lawyers are going to kick this one around forever because the Lord Sumption would know about the legal fees that are available and how long they can push this thing around the courts. And in a way, that to me is a very strange thing. He said that the ECHR will not override our homemade laws, if you like. So in that sense, it's a waste of time them even beginning it, isn't it? Because they're just going to come out with a judgment, but it's not going to be binding. But it will take up a lot of time and distract us. And all the time, more people are coming over.
Bob, do you think that this illegal migration bill will actually sort of get off the ground? Will it work?
Well, they've promised it for years, haven't they? Various Home Secretaries seem to have come unstuck on it. John, I can't remember his name, John, the Labour Home Secretary, said he wasn't fit for purpose. And they just don't seem to be able to get it through. They talk a lot. Tony Blair, going back many years, he talked about marching hooligans up to cash dispensers and all that sort of thing. So I don't think they'll get it through.
Well, that's all we have time for the People's Panel. So back to you, Camilla, but some really fascinating ideas there.
Great work, Tom. Thank you very much. What a great panel. Speaking so much sense. This is what we love about GB viewers and listeners, speaking more sense at times than those actually elected to power. Now, next week, we're going to be in York. So if you speak sense and you'd like to speak sense on the panel, please apply at gbnews.uk/panel. Now, somebody else who speaks a lot of sense, and he's going to be speaking more of it at 11 o'clock, is Michael Portillo, GB News presenter and former Defence Secretary. Now, what do you make of what we have discussed, Michael?
Well, good morning. Well, obviously I have a very long history with the BBC, and I've not always thought that the management was brilliant, but I'm slightly dismayed today by the attacks on BBC management. I mean, I think the BBC management does understand that there's something fundamental and very important at stake here, which is that if we pay a licence fee, which is essentially a tax, and you can be carted off to court if you don't pay it, then there are some obligations that follow from that because everyone is forced to pay it. Therefore, the BBC really does need to be impartial. I mean, that is an important principle. And Gary Lineker does represent the BBC, whether he wishes to or not. And I think he's been very inflexible. I think he's been very inconsiderate. I don't think he is considering the impact that he is having on the beloved BBC, because actually the people who will absolutely relish this row that Lineker has caused, in my view, are the right of the Conservative Party, the people who don't like the BBC at all, because this is really calling into question the survival of the licence fee. And Lineker is responsible for that question being so much in focus this morning.
But it's interesting, isn't it, Michael? I mean, I was always intrigued by your view because you have had to be quite careful. You've done programmes on rail and other things for the BBC, and yet at the same time, you are a former, very senior Tory. So you have to toe that line, and it can be tricky. Clearly, Lineker's come unstuck here, but it's all of his own careerist making, you could argue.
Yeah, I've been employed by the BBC for many years to give my opinion, and I've been asked to do that because I used to be a politician. And I think in giving my opinion, I have to be reasonably polite. I mean, it's obviously, it's no good at all if I don't have a political opinion, because that's what I'm employed to give. On the other hand, I don't think I have to use abusive language about people that I don't agree with. And let's face it, you know, Lineker's language was pretty abusive. And he's not there because he's had a long history in politics. He's there because he's had a long history in football. So I do think that he is showing a lack of consideration to the BBC, which has got the BBC now into a very important pickle. And if the BBC simply, there are hints today they're going to give way, but if they simply give way to Lineker, then they will no longer be able to claim that they are an impartial organisation. I have to say they've given up on impartiality. As soon as the BBC gives up on impartiality, the licence fee becomes untenable.
Yeah. Very briefly, Michael, who have you got on today at 11?
We've got Christopher Hope and Nigel Nelson, two political commentator heavyweights, both of whom are shortly going to join the GB News team. I'll be talking to Tobias Elwood about defence. I've got the very interesting man, Nigel Bigger, who's written this very balanced view of the British Empire. At first, he couldn't find a publisher for his balanced view. And I'll be eating pie and eels.
Oh, OK. Well, enjoy that. Thank you very much. We'll stay tuned for 11. I'm going to stay tuned to see Michael eat pie and eels. Now, coming up, we're going to get the lowdown on the budget this Wednesday from GB News' Liam Halligan and leading businessman Karen Villamoria. But that's all coming after the news with Ray Addison.
10:33, here's the latest. Gary Lineker's eldest son, George, has told the Sunday Mirror he thinks his dad will return to Match of the Day, but he won't back down on his word. It comes after the BBC was forced to broadcast the show without commentary or studio punditry last night. Broadcasters have boycotted the channel after the former footballer was stood down over a tweet criticising the government's migration policy. Rishi Sunak is flying to the US today to discuss the AUKUS defence deal between the UK, the United States and Australia. It's hoped that after a summit with President Biden, the Australian Premier will announce the purchase of British nuclear-powered submarines. While in the US, Mr Sunak is expected to reveal a defence and foreign policy update. And the Health Secretary has criticised junior doctors for failing to call off strike action on Monday. Writing in The Telegraph, Steve Barclay described the 72-hour walkout as incredibly disappointing. The British Medical Association has described Mr Barclay's recent offer to negotiate as a feeble attempt to stall us. It's expected to have the biggest impact of any industrial action by health unions since December. On TV, online and on DAB+ radio, this is GB News.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns. all sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Click that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Thank you for joining me, Camilla Tominey, on this sunny Sunday. Lovely to have your company. Now, the budget is on Wednesday. We need to talk about it. We want to find out what should be in it and what isn't going to be in it. So I'm joined by Liam Halligan, GB News' economics and business editor, and Lord Karen Billamoria, who's founder and chairman of Cobra Beer, vice president of the Confederation of British Industry. Lovely to see you this morning, chaps. Right, let's start with you, Lord Billamoria. What should Jeremy Hunt put in this budget?
This budget should be about growth. What happened last September with the irrational exuberance of this growth strategy of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, absolutely the right idea to go for growth, but they went about it the wrong way. And so people in the markets were looking for some stability, which I think we've now got. But what we now need is a very clear plan for growth, because putting up taxes to the highest level in 70 years is not the way to generate growth.
So you advocate some tax cuts.
Absolutely.
He doesn't seem to be indicating this in any of the interviews he's done.
Not just tax cuts. Don't put up corporation tax from 90 to 25 for a start. That's one, but that's just one of many things he shouldn't be doing in terms of putting up taxes. The thresholds have been frozen, so it's not just companies. Individuals are being affected as well, because if your income tax threshold is frozen and you've got inflation running at 10%, that's a huge tax rise. It's a stealth tax. It's a stealth tax.
Liam, we've seen some of his rhetoric around what he's going to announce on Wednesday. I can't say I'm that enthused by it. There's nothing really there. Is this going to be as safe as houses budget because he wants to put off any tax cuts or anything exciting to the electorate until next year because it's before an election?
Well, this won't be the budget of conviction politicians. It will be the Treasury's budget. It will be the Office for Budget Responsibilities budget. It will be very low wattage. Karen's right. Over the next 4 or 5 years, Camilla, given that the top rate of tax threshold is being frozen until 2028, the number of people who are in that top tax bracket is going to double from 4 million to 8 million. So people, middle managers, not particularly senior teachers, not particularly senior policemen and women will be paying the top rate of tax, the 40% rate of tax. That is astonishingly anti-aspirational and anti-growth. In the building behind you there, Camilla, there are now 40 or 50 Tory MPs. They're part of the Conservative Growth Group. They're not just people who are associated with the right all the time, like John Redwood, who's obviously a low tax kind of person. A lot of middle of the road Tories are saying now is not the time to put up corporation tax by 6 percentage points. The first rise in corporation tax since 1974. A lot has changed since September. The Treasury spent a lot less money than they thought they would spend, and the OBR thought they would spend, on debt interest, on energy subsidy, because wholesale energy prices have been less. Tax receipts have outperformed. Even the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, the most august, even-handed economic think tank in the land, even they are saying there is a lot of fiscal headroom that they could use, and they are warning if we do put up the shutters, Britain is not open for business and raise corporation tax, it will cost a lot of
So
investment.
do we believe them? I think they've said 166 billion.
Well, I always, even as an economist, and maybe because I'm a trained economist, I shy away from, because it's a bit of that. But
Yeah.
conceptually, they must be right, because the OBR's forecasts have been so wildly out in terms of their gloominess. There is fiscal headroom.
Karen,
I couldn't
what do you
agree
think?
with that more. The OBR always are over pessimistic. This is the reality. There is headroom. But we've got a double whammy here. Not only is corporation tax going up by almost 1/3 from 19 to 25, they're removing the super deduction, which is the incentive to invest for companies of 130%. That was one of Rishi's great moves to and it actually worked. We've done the CBI analysis that shows that companies took advantage of this. Now they're taking that away, and we're saying you've got to have an incentive. We're saying, OK, not 130%, even 100% to invest.
But how many people need to say this to them? You know, you've got these US companies pulling out of the UK because we no longer seem attractive for investment.
AstraZeneca.
So you're both saying this.
Ireland.
Who is speaking to Jeremy Hunt? Because he seems to be wanting to do this sort of fix the roof routine, fiscal discipline at all costs. And yet everybody who's a Tory, and indeed people on our People's panel, and indeed people watching this right now, are saying, for God's sake, give us a tax break. The graphics are clear. The graphics show obviously the corporation tax on the rise. I admit it was much lower in the 1970s, but we know what happened to the economy then. The tax burden going up to 38% of national income.
The highest since Clement Attlee.
It's absolutely
the highest
insane.
Since
70 years.
But you must be worried about the Conservatives' reputation for being a low tax and indeed fiscally competent party. It's not the party of business anymore, is it?
Well, what really annoys me is this country, less than 1% of the world's population, has been the second or third largest attractor of inward investment in the world. And now we're losing that attraction for being the best place to invest. The City of London, one of the top 2 financial centres in the world. Our tax rates have to be attractive. Our business environment has to be attractive. Otherwise, businesses will vote with their feet, as we're seeing right now. Listing, we'll lose Arm, a company, phenomenal tech company in Cambridge University. Cambridge, that co-Cambridge ecosystem is listing in America.
You know, small firms pay corporation tax, Camilla. I mean, the bigger firms, they will take this in their stride. They can use some of the investment offsets that I'm sure the Chancellor will talk about to take the sting out of this rise in the headline corporation tax. But small and medium-sized businesses, they haven't got spare cash to invest. This comes straight off their margin. This means a lot of them will close up and go home. So we've just spent billions keeping a load of businesses alive during lockdown, and now we're going to choke off a lot of those businesses with this corporation tax
Squeeze another 6% off their project margins while they don't need it. Liam, I know you interviewed Lord Lawson for the Telegraph today. Now, obviously, he's associated with being somebody who took the Treasury orthodoxy on.
Absolutely.
What's gone wrong since? Because Liz Truss talked about the so-called blob, you know, being in control. I did a piece today for the Telegraph talking about the very interesting links between the IFS, the OBR and the Treasury. There's a degree of groupthink there. It's a high tax ideology.
I am from this world. A lot of these top fiscal officials, I was at university with them. I did graduate work, lots of economic research, econometrics in my 20s with these people. A lot of them are friends of mine, people I've known a long time. And there is a monoculture among them. These aren't the kind of people who go into what they do because they want to stand out or come up with other ideas. You do need conviction politicians at turning points in history. And I do think we are at a turning point in history. And I did interview Lord Lawson down on the South Coast last weekend for my Planet Normal podcast on the Telegraph. I wrote it up in the Telegraph today. I've been talking about the interview on GB News, and he doesn't want to see corporation tax rise. And he doesn't want to lay into the government. His word carries huge weight. He's a political icon, a legend, the macroeconomic architect of Thatcherism. And yet he feels that this government is not going to be known for its tax cutting. And he says it's undesirable and counterproductive that the tax burden is where it currently is. And those words will resonate. Those words will resonate.
Lord Billamoria?
Yeah, and look at the government wants to have a renewable strategy. It wants to incentivize investment in renewables. We're competing with the world, with America, with their Inflation Reduction Act. They've got huge subsidies for renewables. We've got small modular reactors, a nuclear strategy. We've neglected our nuclear industry. We now have companies like Rolls-Royce, which have the ability to set up these small modular reactors that are 1/6 the cost of a giant nuclear plant. They can be put up in 5 years. Have they even started building one? No, the government could easily incentivize that. It should be a priority. There's no urgency.
We should mention one thing, though, shouldn't we, Karen? And this isn't something that the political class has picked up on yet, But tomorrow, financial markets are going to be, at best, skittish.
Yes.
At worst, there could be quite a lot of turmoil because a Silicon Valley bank has gone bust in America, and there will be a lot of concern about that. And look, if Jeremy Hunt's looking for a defence of why he's being so cautious, he could use the market turmoil we're going to see over the next few days to say to people like me, to say to people like Karen Billamoria, look, now is not the time to take any risks at all. And so it may be that if we can get our arms around this banking crisis in America and the impact on tech firms here, it turns out to be politically convenient for the Chancellor.
How dangerous is that in general? I mean, is it the next Northern Rock or is that overblown?
People like me and Karen, who with reputations in business and economics, we have to be careful about fanning the flames of this. It seems to me that it's not a particularly large bank, but it's a bank where a lot of tech companies that have been heavily invested in with high valuations have banked. And so for that reason, there could be quite a sharp market adjustment.
No, this came out of the blue, and there are lots of tech companies that have got millions, if not hundreds of millions of pounds stuck in that bank that they need to access. They can't afford to lose that. They've got to do something about that. But I would say, Liam, this is a time not to use this as an excuse, but to double down on growth, on a strategy, and say, come on, look, come to the UK. You can invest here. We're behind you. We've got a growth strategy. That's what's needed. Not to say we're going to be cautious. We're going to be borrowing. Borrowing is going to go up to 100%. It's almost 100% of GDP. It was 80%.
You mean debt, national debt? Yeah, yes. National debt.
So about 100%. Now, it went up to 250% after the Second World War.
Yes.
We've had the worst global crisis with the pandemic followed by the Ukraine war.
I'm just reminded of Ronald Reagan. The deficit's big enough to look after itself. I mean, is there something in that? I don't know.
Nowhere near that. And even with this cautious strategy, it's forecast to be at 100% 4 or 5 years from now.
Yeah.
So we've got to save businesses, we've got to save the jobs, we've got to help consumers. As Liam says, energy costs have come down, there is headroom. So now's the time to be bold for the government.
Thank you very much, Liam. You'll be analysing the budget for GB News, won't you, on Wednesday, I'm sure?
Very much so.
Looking forward to it. Thank you very much for joining me both. Now, coming up, was Edward VIII a Nazi? Historian and author Alexander Lahmann talks us through this new book, The Windsors at War. But here's a short break. We'll be back in just a jiffy.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway, Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. As you can see, look, I'm holding up this book. Alexander Lahmann, the author of this great book, The Windsors at War, put my teeth in, joins me now. And this is so intriguing because a lot has been said and written about Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson's sympathy for the Nazis. Characterise it for me. I mean, they were appeasers. Were they Hitler fans? And were they affiliated with groups like the Black Shirts? How far did it go?
Well, I think it's fair to say that Wallis wasn't that political, but Edward was a massive fan of Hitler. I mean, he went to meet him in Germany in 1937, and ostensibly he was there to see the industrial progress of the country since the First World War. But in fact, he admired Hitler a huge amount. I mean, later in life, he even said he never thought Hitler was such a bad chap.
Right, so even later in life he didn't acknowledge the foolishness and folly of his links to Germany back in the late 30s.
He was never a man who was into... I mean, he was incredibly foolish and his whole life was folly, but he never acknowledged that.
You are quite scathing about him as a person. Characterise him for us, Edward VIII, because you're not flattering in this book.
I'm very scathing about him as a person. I think he's probably one of the worst men ever to have been king, because he was so self-obsessed and so selfish and so venal that every single action of his, including the treacherous ones, have to be seen through the prism of somebody who believed that there was nothing in life that he didn't deserve and didn't merit. And do you think, I mean, is that what everybody thinks when they become king? I mean, under the surface, is that genuinely that you think you can do whatever you like? Because he certainly did. And if you read all his letters, I mean, it's astonishing. You keep thinking, you're like a Bond villain or something.
Really? And then I suppose a lot is said in a negative way about Wallis Simpson, but actually she comes out better in the relationship than he does. You know, perhaps it was misogynistic at the time, blame the American divorcee, when actually he's the one who's got major character flaws.
I think so, and I think Wallis has been unfairly maligned over the years. There's been a lot of sexism talks about her as well. I mean, she was certainly somebody who liked the finer things in life, but I don't think of her as a bad person, just somebody who was selfish like him. But he was certainly somebody who, I mean, we look at the present day Duke and Duchess of Sussex and we can see there are a fair number of parallels, actually.
I was wondering if you were going to go there. You've done it. This will create a Twitter storm, just to warn you. But are there parallels? I mean, it would be quite cruel, wouldn't it, to compare Prince Harry to Edward VIII, because you've been so scathing about him. But...
What's interesting at one point is the Duke of Windsor says that he wants to bat away the impertinent suggestion that I'm a publicity seeker. And as soon as I read that in one of his letters, I thought that's exactly what Harry keeps saying, but I don't want all this publicity. I don't want to be in the public eye all the time. And I'm thinking, for a man who doesn't want to be in the public eye, you're giving a very, very good account of being constantly in the media.
When they were exiled to the Bahamas, what did they actually do? Because the book also speaks to huge periods of boredom where they're both there just twiddling their thumbs, completely away from the royal scene, sort of effectively perhaps making trouble.
Well, they were sent to the Bahamas because they were such trouble, and because Edward's obviously Nazi sympathies meant that his being in Europe meant the whole thing was really, really impossible. But obviously, what I find incredibly funny is that he goes to the Bahamas, you know, thousands of miles away from where it's thought he can cause trouble, and he meets Nazi sympathisers there, which shows a real dedication to seeking out the worst people you can imagine.
How badly do you think this reflects on George VI and indeed Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother? I mean, actually, her portrayal isn't entirely favourable either in this book.
Well, it's interesting because I tried to be fair and balanced about everybody, and certainly the king was somebody who, until he got into his stride in the Second World War, he was really floundering. I mean, he was really unable, because he never wanted to be king, and it's very much thrust upon him. And his wife, I mean, she's tough, and that's what we forget, because we have this idea of the Queen Mother as a sort of lovable, gin-drinking, you know, auntie. But in fact, when you see how she had to run the royal household, and she was very much in charge of the king, she was practically the power behind the throne herself. So we can see that Edward and Wallis and George and Elizabeth, it's very much the woman in charge in both situations.
Can we clear up a degree of confusion about their links to the Germans in the late 30s, and indeed this notion that initially George VI and his wife did support Hitler? Is that taking it too far?
Yes, I think that's definitely taking it too far. I mean, what's fair to say is that George and I suppose the Queen were both supporters of appeasement, because George was a man who I think always wanted father figures, and Neville Chamberlain, the then Prime Minister, and Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary.
Yeah, there was a controversy over Chamberlain appearing on the Buckingham Palace balcony, for instance.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that everybody thought that war with Germany was the worst possible thing that could happen. And so people were bending over backwards to appease Hitler. And so the king was very much thinking all this time, we've got to appease Hitler. But his private secretary, Alec Harding, whose diaries I use his diaries and letters are used in the book for the first time, he knew it was a bad idea because he'd fought in the First World War, and he could say, this is just going to lead to absolute devastation. There is no possibility with a man like Hitler that we can actually seek peace terms with him.
So there's a distinction then, it seems to me, between George VI talking about appeasement in terms of trying to find peace in Europe, and Edward VIII, his brother, talking about appeasement because he actually supported Hitler, and that's where that line is drawn. There was once an image, I don't know if you remember it, Alexander, of the Queen, Elizabeth II, appearing to Nazi salute alongside her sister, Princess Margaret. Much was made of that. It was the front page of the Sunday Express some years ago. What do you make of that? Were they play acting? What was going on there?
What I make of that is that they were doing it as a joke. I mean, they were too young to understand the import of it, and obviously this was a long time before the Second World War. I mean, they were certainly not doing it with any kind of sympathy. Edward, on the other hand, knew exactly what he was doing, and it's interesting because there's often been a lot of debate about was he giving Nazi salutes right, left and centre. I think the answer is almost certainly. I mean, the fact that we have these images of him looking very, very happy doing so. I mean, I think he would have liked to have come back to Britain as a kind of puppet dictator. I think he genuinely would have relished the idea of being king with Hitler as a kind of president of the United States of Europe.
Good grief. And on Churchill, let's just very briefly discuss his relationship with both Edward VIII and then latterly with George VI.
Well, it's interesting because Churchill was a great supporter of Edward VIII during the abdication crisis, but as the war went on, it's quite funny because there's actually a draft of a letter in which Churchill explicitly says the Duke's allegiances are known to be pro-Nazi, and you think, that's a fairly astonishing thing to say about the man who used to be king. But his relationship with George VI was much better because it began with a level of mutual distrust, but eventually it became this very close working partnership, which continued after the war and after Churchill stopped being Prime Minister.
You could even say perhaps that, it was a brotherly relationship in the absence of Edward VIII that actually George VI needed to turn to someone, and in the end it was Churchill, and they formed this extraordinary alliance that helps the war effort.
And I think that, that image of the King and Churchill standing next to each other on VE Day, it's a great, it's a great powerful image because we see exactly what happened between them, and we see the King and the Prime Minister working very harmoniously.
Alexander Lahmann, thank you very much. You can check out his book here, look. It's brilliant and you should get a copy. Now, I'll be back next week at 9:30. You've heard this already, but Michael Portillo is going to eat eel on his show, so please stay tuned for that. I'll see you next week.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully